All right. We also find that it's really helpful just to start the conversation with a little background about Ready for 100, and then we're going to introduce our speakers. And our speakers, this is honestly a moderated conversation. Like, these are folks in the Chicago area who are doing stellar work, who are making the connections between industries, communities, policies, really to ensure that the transition to 100% clean energy, as well as other work, is truly done in a way that meets community needs. And we'll be digging into that with our speakers as well. After our speakers, we'll have an opportunity to go into those breakout groups to really let it marinate, and then come up with some ideas ourselves for what we want to see in Chicago's clean energy transition plan. So the Ready for 100 Chicago campaign really has been building on momentum that has been rolling along for a little while here in Chicago. The call for 100% clean energy is not something new to this campaign, but this team was able to help bring community groups and other advocates and simply our neighbors together to say, hey, we want to make sure that this transition happens in a good, equitable, justice-centric way. And so we are really grateful that we've been building upon the momentum around racial equity and economic justice for this conversation. So last year, we became the largest city at that time in April 2019 to actually commit to this type of goal. And we did that through a resolution in City Council. So that is a little bit of background about the actual campaign, and I'm going to toss it to our facilitators for tonight to get us started with a little background on tonight's issue, which is better health.
So hi everybody, my name is Kelsey Strobel, and I'm going to be walking through an introduction on air pollution, the health impacts, and some of the policy solutions that are currently in the works. So I'm going to start with a little background on what air pollution actually is. The two most common outdoor pollutants are ozone, known as smog, and particulate matter, known as soot. These pollutants enter the atmosphere from vehicles and power plants. So Chicago has high concentrations of these air pollutants, in part due to our levels of traffic congestion and power plants that produce greenhouse gas emissions. Next slide. This is a really big issue for the health of our communities because these air pollutants increase the risk of lung cancer, respiratory and cardiovascular diseases, and developmental and reproductive issues, among others. And these health impacts are also exacerbated on hotter days, which are increasing in frequency due to the impacts from climate change. Next slide. Over the past decade, increased levels and daily spikes of these pollutants has caused Chicago's air quality to get increasingly worse over the years, with the city now ranked as the 16th most polluted city in the nation as of this year. On top of that, this air pollution occurs in higher concentrations in the city's south and west sides. This is partially due to the high percentages of those communities living in close proximity to multimodal transit terminals, but these communities are also burdened with increased air pollution due to projects like the following. Next slide. The Matte Asphalt plant in McKinley Park uses petroleum products in its production that contain carcinogenic chemicals that emit hazardous particulate matter, as well as really terrible odors. The construction of the plant was fast-tracked by the city and the Illinois EPA with no consultation with the residents or a public comment period. Now, the plant may receive a 10-year extension despite hundreds of public complaints about the pollution. Hillco developers, on the other hand, demolished an old Crawford coal plant in Little Village without notifying residents, leaving the neighborhood covered in dirt and other particulate matter during the coronavirus pandemic. Hillco now plans to build Target warehouses on the site, likely increasing diesel trucks in the area and worsening air pollution in the long term. Then there's General Iron, the metal shredding operation that is planning on relocating to the southeast side from the Lincoln Park area. The move comes after years of complaints from the Second Ward's aldermen about clouds of black dust, metallic odors, and other pollution emitted from the factory, as well as several violations of the Clean Air Act. Now the relocation plan has been finalized, with construction of the new plant to begin in the southeast side in 2021. Next slide, please. So there are many federal, state, and local policies that are meant to protect communities from harm and encourage the adoption of renewable energy, which will help reduce air pollutants from power plants and vehicles. For example, the Future Energy Jobs Act, or FEJA, passed in 2016 to establish several programs to increase the adoption of affordable renewable energy, including rooftop solar, community solar projects, and renewable energy credits, or RECs. FEJA set the target of achieving 25% renewable energy by 2025, but we've currently only reached 8% so far. But there is a bill currently before the Illinois legislature, the Clean Energy Jobs Act, or CEJA, as you can see in the same bubble, which will expand funding for solar and coordinate job trainings for a smooth transition. Moving forward with these bills, Chicago also needs full transparency and accountability from its electric utility, ComEd, which currently faces a lack of accountability measures. ComEd's 30-year franchise agreement is about to expire, and many Chicagoans are calling for the municipalization of ComEd under the Democratize ComEd campaign, or DemComEd. This basically means it would give power to the people to elect the decision makers for the city's energy needs and funding. Next slide. So to address Chicago's current energy shortcomings and prioritize the health and well-being of our communities above corporate greed, Chicago must take actionable steps towards achieving our goal of a 100% clean, renewable energy economy with Ready for 100. This transition would greatly improve air quality, reducing the risk of not only respiratory and cardiovascular harm, but also the risk and susceptibility to COVID-19. So by advocating for a clean energy economy, improving infrastructure, committing to equity, and putting power back in the hands of the people, Chicago can reduce emissions of air pollutants, thereby protecting and preserving the health of its residents. So with all of that, I'm going to now let each of our panelists have a little time to introduce themselves.
Thank you, Kelsey. Yes, so we're now jumping into the panelist portion of this module. And maybe we can start with, let's go in order of Lavannya, Edith, and then Roberto, if each of you could give an introduction on yourselves and the work that you do.
Sure. Can folks hear me okay? Okay, awesome. So hi everyone, my name is Lavannya Pulluveetil Barrera. I live in the Brighton Park neighborhood of Chicago, so very close to that matte asphalt plant that we were just talking about. So thanks for bringing that up in this conversation. More attention definitely needs to be brought to these issues, so I appreciate that. I'm joining you all today as an employee of Vote Solar. Vote Solar is a national nonprofit with a mission to repower the U.S. with clean energy by making solar power itself more affordable and accessible through effective policy and advocacy. Our organization prides itself on providing a combo of really deep technical expertise and policy expertise to various legislative and regulatory campaigns across the nation. So currently we work in about 25 states to various levels of depth, but Illinois is definitely one of our main priority states, and we are definitely pushing for the passage of the Clean Energy Jobs Act here. So that's one of our primary campaigns here in Illinois. And we work with all kinds of partners to advance solar energy programs and policies that really enable scalable but also equitable solar solutions. So within my role at Vote Solar, I kind of lead our organizational transition to becoming a more equitable partner to organizations that represent frontline communities, low wealth communities, and communities of color. Vote Solar is going through a transition where initially our mission was all about just increasing solar for the sake of clean power. But as the organization has grown older, we recognize that there are inequities within solar, and we need to have a greater attention to the kinds of impacts that solar has on communities and ensuring equity throughout that process. So I specifically lead our partnership work, and part of that involves a lot of community outreach and engagement. So I host capacity building workshops and webinars that are meant to educate and empower folks that are interested in energy issues and engaging on a more deeper level, really focusing on the policy tools and skills needed, and also some background on the energy system that we have. So that's an overview of what I do and what Vote Solar does, and I'm really looking forward to the rest of the conversation. Thanks for the invite.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So it's great to hear about your work. Roberto, could you please introduce yourself?
Hi, my name is Roberto Clack. I'm the Associate Director with the Warehouse Workers for Justice. We're a worker center based outside of the largest inland port in North America, Center Point in Joliet in Elwood, Illinois. And a lot of people ask, like, what does this labor rights worker center have anything to do with clean energy and the environment and things like that? And I would say that we got involved in this work through happenstance. One of the ways was really talking to Alvejo, who was concerned about the Hilco warehouse, and that's part of the way the dialogue started. And then another way is that there was a huge fight around a proposal called North Point in Elwood, Illinois. That's a 3,000 acre project that's being proposed right now. It shifted municipalities. It started in Elwood and then went to Will County, and now is trying to get Joliet, Illinois to do its bidding. But it's a project that's slated to be larger than the loop, just to give you a sense of the size of what we're doing. And then the Will County and the inland port itself is responsible for moving 3.5% of the nation's GDP. And as many people know, transportation has surpassed energy creation as the largest contributor to climate change and local pollution. So we're a frontline community in the sense that we're dealing with a lot of air quality issues because of the amount of freight that moves in and out. The port's well over 10,000 trucks a day that go in and out of the area. But the way we kind of got involved is that we connected with local community members and environmental justice organizations, and we realized that the same people who oppress the workforce in these warehouses also oppress the local community through bad development deals, through the local pollution, through not paying their fair share for the infrastructure costs. So we've really rallied together with these different entities because we saw that our interests align and that we would be more powerful if we bounded together to hold some of these major corporations accountable. And in our area, it's a who's who of Fortune 500 companies, but obviously Amazon is a big one. And their whole business scheme is predicated on transportation, last mile deliveries to people's homes. And we see this, before COVID with, more people are doing Lyft and Uber and things like this. And COVID's intensified the home deliveries, whether you're getting your Grubhub or your Amazon deliveries. So I think if we're really talking about fighting for environmental justice, we do have to take on the issues of transportation, but we also have to take on that many of the workers in these industries are also oppressed, and we need to fight for them too. It's not fair to transition to electrification and still leave workers being oppressed. So we're here to be a voice to fight for, in a principled way, both for the labor movement and the environment. Thank you.
Thank you. Edith, will you please introduce yourself?
Yes, hello everyone. Can everyone hear me okay? Yes, awesome. So good evening, everyone. My name is Edith Tovar. I'm with the Little Village Environmental Justice Organization. I'm also a lifelong resident of the Little Village community. I'm really excited to speak with everyone here today. Just, briefly, El Vejo was founded in 1994. We just completed 26 years in the community, and our organization was established by concerned parents and residents, in which they were noticing a lot of environmental injustices in the community. It started off with, unfortunately, children passing out in their school because their school was being, their school's roof was being fixed, and so tar was being laid out during the school year. So parents, took this fight right to the principal, and the sad realization is that the school principal had to kind of figure out, right, with the limited budget, and rather to fix their roof, their school's roof, during the academic year, in which it was cheaper, or during the summer, in which obviously it was a little bit more expensive and children weren't around. And so luckily, right, the neighborhood school and the parents were able to figure out a schedule in which these fixes were going to be made. But after that, a lot of the parents continued to make note of what was happening. For those not familiar with Little Village, the Little Village community houses the third largest industrial corridor. It takes up at least 40% of our land use in our community. Our community is very dense. We have a population of about 90,000 residents. And it is the second youngest neighborhood in the city of Chicago. So we have a lot of children and young people. And it also, unfortunately, has the second worst air quality in the state of Illinois. So we're obviously an organization that fights, right, for environmental justice. And the mission of El Vejo is to accomplish environmental justice in the Little Village community by achieving self-determination of immigrants, low-income, and working class families. And one of the most known campaign that we have was the shutdown of the Fisk and Crawford coal plant, which were the last two remaining coal plants operating in the city of Chicago. And that campaign still continues today. We have we spent years working with the city, working with Little Village residents and organizations to come up with a vision of what we wanted to see at these sites that were once obviously a cause of a lot of public health and environmental damage. A document was completed, and unfortunately, Chicago politics, the Crawford coal plant and Fisk generating station were sold to Hilco Redevelopment Partners. I added a link here with the Southside Weekly's op-ed, which gives a little bit more of an understanding and a timeline of, how Hilco came to the city, how this development unfortunately was approved. And now the organization is obviously pushing with residents and allies to, for Hilco to vacate our Little Village community. We saw some images right at the beginning of the presentation that they decided to implode a smokestack that was nearly a century, a year old, operating for close to 75 years during a pandemic. During that time, our community was also seeing high numbers of positive cases of COVID-19. And so, we continue to do a lot of this work. Same thing, I'm really glad Roberto, mentioned how many of the workers that are in these type of industries, right, are not only going to work and unfortunately facing a lot of labor discriminations, but they're also coming back to these communities in which a lot of these industries are continuing to pollute, so furthering and endangering their public health. If we can go to the next slide, I feel like I've kind of spoken a lot, so I'm just gonna invite people to, if you're familiar with our campaign, I invite you to text El Vejo to the number here, 69866. This will redirect you to send an email to the City of Chicago, Hilco, and Target Corporation, who is the company that will be leasing this warehouse, in support of the Little Village community and residents for our right for self-determination and our right for our just transition that we fought for 12 years. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I was just texting now, and it gives you a link, and then then it looks like you can make your voice heard. So I hope everyone takes the time to do that. So we're going to get into some questions for each of our panelists, and I invite everyone in the audience to drop any questions that you may have during just in the chat, and we can hopefully get to as many as possible. So this first question is for Lavannya. Lavannya, can you please discuss the impact that access to solar has on public health?
Yeah, sure. So first, I think it would be helpful to add to the context that was set up at the beginning of this call. So by starting off by saying that we have a deeply inequitable energy system. BIPOC communities, that's Black and Indigenous, people of color communities, disproportionately suffer from the health consequences of our outdated, dirty, inefficient energy infrastructure and system. I pulled some statistics for y'all. So approximately 68% of African Americans live within 30 miles of a coal-fired power plant. 40% of communities of color are breathing in polluted air, like unsafe air to breathe in. And currently 25 million Americans in the United States have asthma, with the highest rates being in Black and Hispanic communities. So, all of this is really alarming information. And to add to that, thinking about our current COVID pandemic and what all those pre-existing exposures to pollution do for respiratory health, only, is exacerbated. Those same communities are facing higher rates of COVID. So just wanted to put that context out there, because when we talk about solar, it's really about righting some of those wrongs. And we see solar as a way to start chipping away at some of those historical injustices. So we see solar and additionally battery storage, those two technologies paired, as a way to reduce pollution by replacing some of our fossil fuel infrastructure, such as peaker plants, which are plants that only run for certain parts of the year, and diesel generators. So replacing those two with solar and storage as a way to reduce our emissions of greenhouse gases, but also air pollutants. So when we talk about those other things that we want to cut down on, we're talking about like nitrous oxide, sulfur dioxide, and additionally particulate matter. So we see solar as kind of a way to transition away from all of those negative things. I'll give an example. There's a coalition in New York called the Peak Coalition, and they're really pushing to have more solar and storage in communities that have coal-fired peaker plants as a way to close down those plants. So completely shutter those plants and use the energy that is coming from solar and backup batteries. So to transition from that old way of generating and supplying our energy to a healthier way that reduces all of those negative things that go into the air. So that's one element of how solar affects health. But another way that solar and battery storage affect health that I think is important for us to talk about in this discussion is also when we're thinking about our elderly and medically vulnerable populations. So these are populations that are more likely to rely on medical equipment that requires electricity, requires it to be plugged in and receiving constant power. So as we deal with more and more of the impacts of climate change, like the wildfires that we're seeing in California, the hurricanes that all result in disruptions to our power, where people see more power outages. It's also important to think of solar and battery storage together as a way to increase the health and safety of those populations. We're seeing more and more communities that have a large population of elderly folks and medically vulnerable folks transitioning to setting up little microgrids for community centers so that those folks can get somewhere safe, ensure that they have constant access to power during those turbulent times when we might see power outages or cuts to power. So those are just two ways. I want to also open it up to the other panelists if they have additions, but that's kind of where we focus our work of talking about peaker plants, and also as a way to ensure reliability and safety for those that rely on electricity.
Thank you. There was a lot in there. I really appreciate some of the statistics that you have. And I myself have a couple of follow-up questions, but I want to make sure that we give time for the prepared questions that we have and audience questions as well. So thank you so much. This one is a question for Roberto. Can you discuss how clean energy relates to logistics, transportation, and warehouse expansion as outlined in the COVID recovery plan put forth by Mayor Lightfoot?
Yeah, I think that, warehousing and logistics is really, it was a growing industry even before COVID. A lot of, as people know, a lot of manufacturing has left the United States and gone to places like China and Southeast Asia. So major corporations completely depend on the logistics and warehousing industry to be able to generate the billions of dollars that they do. And warehousing's grown exponentially in our region. Will County's been the fastest job growth place in the state year after year. We're approaching over 200,000 warehouse workers in the state. So it's a massive employer. So I think really dealing with freight and warehousing and logistics in an intentional way to make sure that it's cleaner and it's sustainable is very important. I think that corporate campaigns are a big part of that. We've demanded that Amazon take action. Walmart just announced that they're going to be doing some stuff. While these are steps in the right direction, we need to be vigorous to make sure that they actually follow through. And that, I think at the same time, we need to demand that since these kind of corporations have to be here, and they need, Chicagoland's the only place where 6 out of the 7 Class 1 railroads converge, and it's trillions of dollars worth of goods come from our rails. And that means we have a lot of leverage, actually. So I think that our specific region and city of Chicago can do a lot more to make sure that we leverage that these corporations have sustainable transportation, and that we also have the infrastructure to handle that. So yeah, I mean, I think there's just a ton we can do as a movement to hold these companies in the overall industry accountable for clean energy transportation.
Could you maybe give a couple examples of how you can make warehousing more sustainable?
I think, so last mile, right? I think there's a real opportunity there, possibly. There's parts of the transportation industry that are going to be harder to convert to sustainable transport. Long haul trucking is the first thing that comes to mind. But with some of the short hauling, there's these drayage trucks where we're at in Joliet, where the truck goes from the train yard, goes to a warehouse, and back all day long. We got to demand that the companies that use those trucks electrify them, right? If it comes to the last mile where there's pretty set routes and they're short distance, and the vehicle begins and ends at the same place, that's an opportunity to have sustainable transportation. And the companies that have this business just make, unimaginable amounts of money. So I think a lot of it is, the movement really figuring out where are the strategic places we can intervene to convert these things, and then, really applying the pressure. So those are some ideas that we have, and we're looking to take action on as we kind of expand in this area of work.
Awesome, thank you. And Edith, this one is a question for you. Can you share how El Vejo's work weaves together the issues of clean energy, health, and democracy? And what does meaningful engagement look like to you in your work?
What an easy question. So for starters, we always say that our community and our community residents are the experts. They have been living right in the community for X amount of years, and to see and live through environmental injustices, right, is something that a lot of our residents are starting to be very outspoken, right, as far as the demolition or the implosion of the Crawford coal plant, continuing to push for especially our food and street vendors in the community, right, to also be protected. And so I bring that up because we also have a community garden. So a lot of our campaigns, right, they were not 5-year campaigns. A lot of our campaigns literally took more than 10 years. And we always go and follow through, the framework of self-determination, of community residents being, having a level of expertise. Since El Vejo was established, we always made sure that our young people were always part of these conversations. And one example that I can think of, we have a youth program or a youth educator within our organization, and they have done such an amazing job working with young people at the local high school. And they have been, establishing really great working relationships with the teachers and helping us, right, collect data that the city of Chicago hasn't even thought of collecting, like how many trucks, right, are passing through specific intersections that we call like toxic corridors, because we are seeing hundreds of diesel trucks coming through these specific locations. One of them being on 31st and Pulaski. That is one of the intersections in which we see high pedestrian level, right, from young people to community residents traveling. That's where the Pulaski bus, right, kind of changes, going from, all the way to the south side, all the way to the north side. And we try to follow with the path of justice, safety, wellness, and health through our community visions. So I mentioned during my introduction that we worked with residents and other allies to develop a just transition vision of what we wanted to see at the Crawford coal plant and at Fisk. And I can add those links after I'm on the chat so that folks can visit our website and start looking at that, right? But one thing for sure, when we're talking about jobs, right? I'm really glad Lavannya brought it up, how solar energy is not accessible or is not accessible to Black, Indigenous, people of color communities. One thing that I wanted to highlight and uplift is the Illinois Solar for All program. This is a program that we're working with other environmental justice organizations in the city of Chicago, the Chicago Environmental Justice Network, which encompasses 5 other organizations in the city, in which we're really, trying to bridge, right, that the lack of representation, right, from EJ communities in these type of programs, but also thinking about that just transition in an economic lens, right, where we're giving folks the opportunity, especially returning citizens, right, an opportunity to be part of this growing industry, which is the solar industry, an opportunity to learn about this new industry, to make a living, right? We're always talking about self-determination, and so through these programs and projects, that's how we're trying to connect the issues that we're seeing constantly, right? And also, one thing that I also wanted to connect is our work with Warehouse Workers for Justice, right? One of the myths that I believe people think is that environmental justice organizations, they don't want polluters. And, at the other lens, for us, they're polluters, and within a different lens, right? Folks think that these are really great jobs. And so for us working with Warehouse Workers for Justice, right, is for us to also understand and making sure, right, that we're not against jobs, right? We're not against people obviously trying to survive and make a living, but we also want dignifying jobs. And I think that's like one of the slogans that Warehouse Workers has, right, is that we want dignified, we want jobs that pay a living wage. And so when we're talking about a just transition, we also have to make sure that we're talking about not leaving people behind, not making sure that folks are allowed, right, to have this economic prosperity. And so we try to combine all of these important subjects, right, into the work that we do. And so, yeah, I kind of lost my little train of thought there. But yeah, I'll end it there. Sorry.
No, please don't say sorry. That was a great overview, and I liked hearing about all the different programs that Ovejo is doing awesome work with and for. We have a question from Kyra for any of the panelists. She asks, what kind of health improvements would you like to see in impacted communities for workers, seniors, students, etc.?
Well, I mean, for starters, right? Not, we were also starting to talk about policies earlier, and obviously one of the biggest um, things that at the last or 2 years of the Rahm Emanuel administration, right, is that they were doing this industrial corridor modernization process. For us in Little Village, we started doing that process, and this was an opportunity for us to work with the Chicago Department of Planning. And this was an opportunity for us to kind of highlight, right, how the Little Village Industrial Corridor is set up in a really messed up way. I don't know how else to put it, where you have industries operating right next to a high school, an industry like B-Way that emits terrible odors, and kind of like the same thing at the big why El Vejo was established, right? A lot of the students and teachers and staff are complaining of terrible odors. And so for us, that was an opportunity to work with them to kind of highlight, right, what were some of the environmental injustices that we were seeing. And unfortunately, because of the new administration, that process was halted. And so a lot of the time and investment that students, residents, right, took to make sure that their voices were being heard were kind of just put on a shelf. And so for us, some of the basic health improvements, right, would be to take a look at the industries, right? I know that a lot of our communities, especially our communities in the Southwest side and in the West side, are heavily burdened with a lot of heavy industry. And y'all gave the example, right, of General Iron moving from Lincoln Park to the Southeast side. One thing also is that you know, the city obviously has resources. El Vejo was pushing for the Chicago Department of Public Health to set up air monitors before Hilco started demolishing the Crawford coal plant, and you know they didn't even give us that. They didn't they didn't provide that service for folks to be able to monitor the air quality in case, you know, we do need it to make adjustments, right, for the folks living directly across the demolition site. And so El Vejo had to set up our own air monitoring network. So we have about 5 air monitors close to the site and across the neighborhood to just, you know, make sure that we are keeping track of our air quality. So some of those improvements would be just to like actually take note, right, of what the organizations are providing. These are things that were needed and things that were suggested and unfortunately, you know, most of the time have been dismissed.
Thank you for that.
For me, I just always go back to the basics of like everyone having clean air, clean water to drink, and access to culturally appropriate and healthy, fresh local produce. I know that kind of goes outside the scope of what we're talking about here, but I think that if we reoriented ourselves to reminding ourselves that ultimately that's what folks deserve at the end of the day, it would help in some of these more technical conversations. And so, yeah, that's just where my mind went in response to that question. Not very specific in terms of solutions, but it's always good to remember that that's ultimately what we want people to have.
Real briefly, where we work in Will County, 8% of the population have been diagnosed with new asthma cases. So the fight for sustainable clean energy transportation is really a life and death one. You know, and along with, you know, I've kind of stated that why we need electrification in transportation, we also need to make sure that the source of where that power comes from is a renewable energy source. We see in China, you know, they're expanding electric vehicles, but if you're also expanding coal at the same time, you could be making things worse. So I think those are some things to keep in mind. And then I think just anti-poverty. You know, many of our workers come from the south side of Chicago and work in the warehouses. And there's a great study done by a Cook County Equity Group, and it showed that if you're of a certain demographic and make a certain income, you could live, you know, 20 to 30 years less than people in a different area code. So I think, you know, really fighting for economic rights and justice is also a part of this equation.
Yes, absolutely. And Lavannya, one thing you said that I thought was interesting, talking about food, how maybe that's kind of outside the scope of this discussion. But it's funny that you mentioned that, because as we were preparing for this, there were a couple different topics that we were thinking about including in this presentation, you know, related to transportation, and we're like, well, does that get into other topics? And what we were discussing is just that everything here is really related. There's, yeah, everything is so connected, and you can't really talk about health without talking about racial justice, without talking about climate impacts. And yeah, so that was really interesting to me. And Roberto, you kind of picked up on that too, talking about anti-poverty. And yes, intersectionality. There we go. So we have, I think we have about 2 minutes. Okay, I think we might be going to a break now. Kyra, should I pass it on to you?
Well, I was going to say we don't have to come back at 7. I think we should be able to give folks some time. But were there any other questions that either that were in the chat or any other final notes that our speakers wanted to share. I can't see you, so go ahead.
This is Edith. No, I think I'm good. I think there was a reminder onto if you want to take, if you want to take an action and support El Vejo's campaign, I can add in the text El Vejo to the number. I'll reshare it. Thank you.
And I'll chime in here and say that if you want to get action alerts that are specific to you and where you live, feel free to head to Vote Solar's website and sign up for our mailing list. You'll get updates about what we're doing across the country, but then also opportunities to take action will come your way.
Awesome. Cool.